The ground trembled beneath Zane Morrison's feet as the roar of the beast echoed through the smoke-choked air. The distant skyline of the ruined city flickered with the heat of exploding ordnance, but it was the creature that stole his focus. A hulking mass of muscle, bone, and rage, its glowing red eyes locked onto Zane's position. Zane's heart raced, and every muscle in his body screamed for action. He didn't know what was worse, the monster in front of him or the monster inside himself. His mind was still racing, trying to find a way out of this mess. His instincts, however, were already taking over. Before he could think, his body lurched forward, moving of its own accord. A flash of steel caught his peripheral vision. Mercenaries, soldiers hired by the general, surrounded him, weapons trained on his chest. "Back off, Morrison," one of them barked, voice shaking with a mix of fear and authority. Zane paused. His chest heaved as his senses sharpened. His heightened hearing picked up their heartbeats, their breaths, and the fear beneath their threats. He knew they were no different from the others, the ones who had made him what he was. Tools, pawns in a larger game. But that didn't matter. He wasn't here for them. The beast roared again, snapping Zane back to reality. The mercenaries hesitated, clearly unsure whether to focus on him or the towering creature now charging toward them. Zane's eyes flicked back and forth between the two threats. His hands clenched into fists. "Get moving," he told himself. "Focus." But his body wasn't listening. A surge of power coursed through him, raw, unfiltered. He didn't remember the last time he'd felt this alive. Without warning, he lunged at the nearest mercenary, his speed and strength catching the soldier off guard. The man's rifle clattered to the ground as Zane's fist collided with his chest, sending him sprawling. Before the others could react, Zane had already pivoted, his legs propelling him toward the beast. "Zane, wait!" The voice broke through the chaos, a familiar, desperate tone. Zane's head snapped to the side to see Dr. Evelyn Drake rushing toward him, her lab coat flapping in the wind. Zane's breath hitched. He hadn't seen her in months, not since the day they had parted ways under duress, forced into separate paths by the very program that had created him. Dr. Drake had been the scientist behind his transformation, the one who had helped reshape his body into something unrecognizable. But her presence here, in the midst of this hellscape, made him hesitate. She was the reason for everything he was, a soldier, a weapon. But Zane wasn't sure if he could blame her. Not anymore. The truth was murky, and it gnawed at him. "Zane, you can't do this," she pleaded, her voice breaking through the thick tension in the air. "The creature, it's not what you think. You're not the only weapon here." Zane's eyes narrowed. "Not what I think." His voice was thick with emotion, but his words were sharp. "You created this. You made me like this." The creature's roar interrupted their conversation, and Zane turned just in time to see its massive claws slashing through the air, sending debris scattering. The soldiers, now completely distracted, scrambled to reposition themselves. The beast was too close. He could smell the burning flesh in the air, feel the heat radiating from its body. This isn't me," Zane whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But it was a lie. He could feel the beast's rage pulsing inside him, echoing through his bones. "I never wanted this for you, Zane," Dr. Drake said, desperation now tinged with guilt. "But you can't become this monster. You're better than this. You still have control." Zane didn't reply immediately. His fingers twitched, the strength beneath his skin demanding release. His body was a weapon, his instincts were all-consuming. But in his chest, a small, flickering part of him, the man he had once been, refused to die. "Do you really want to kill again, Zane?" he asked himself. But the weight of his past actions, the lives he'd taken as an unwilling instrument of war, bore down on him. It would be so easy to let the rage take over. To embrace the monster he had become. Drake stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm, grounding him. "This isn't who you are," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. The sincerity in her voice struck him hard. She didn't want him to be the weapon. But she had made him one. Zane inhaled deeply, clenching his fists. For a moment, the world went quiet. The sounds of battle faded away, leaving only the thrum of his heart and the weight of Dr. Drake's words. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for his humanity. With a roar of his own, Zane leapt into the fray, not as a beast, but as a man, one who was still struggling to find his place in a world that had tried to destroy him. The mercenaries scattered, and the creature's attention snapped back to him. Zane's body burned with a surge of energy, but this time, he held the reins. Not today, he thought. As he closed in on the beast, Zane made a silent vow to himself, to destroy the monster in front of him before it consumed the man he was becoming. The heavy scent of blood mixed with smoke clung to the air. Zane's pulse pounded in his ears as he stood at the entrance of the Resistance's underground compound. The metallic taste of adrenaline still lingered on his tongue from the battle, his muscles tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. Zane, Dr. Evelyn Drake's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the chaos of his thoughts. She had followed him into the compound, her steps hesitant, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes. You don't have to do this alone. Let us help you. Zane didn't turn to face her, his gaze locked on the steel doors ahead. He could hear the faint hum of machinery behind them, the quiet conversations of Resistance members preparing for their next move. His chest tightened. How long before they found him? How long before they discovered that the man who had been created to fight for their cause was no longer sure where his allegiance lay? You did this to me, he muttered, voice low, carrying the weight of years of regret. You turned me into this. Evelyn flinched but didn't argue. She had no words to make it right. She had made him into the very thing he hated, and there was no taking it back. Zane's body, a fusion of human and technology, was a weapon, a tool of destruction, but it had always been more. She had always believed in him. But in her eyes now, Zane saw only a reminder of his past, the scars that had shaped him. I know you blame me, she said softly, stepping closer. But there's still time to fix this. You're not just some tool of war, Zane. Her voice faltered. You're still human. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. The muscles beneath his skin twitched, the urge to tear something apart building in his chest. The monster inside him was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to emerge. I am more than this, he reminded himself, but the words felt hollow. Zane turned finally, his eyes meeting hers, the gold of his irises glowing faintly in the dim light. I've killed people, Evelyn. Men, women, children. I've wiped out entire families. What am I supposed to do with all of that? You say I'm human. But I'm not. Not anymore. Evelyn's breath caught, and for a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was thick with the weight of their shared history. Finally, Zane broke the silence, his voice steely. They're coming. The General. The mercenaries. They'll find us, and when they do, they'll take me back. They'll turn me into their weapon again. We'll fight, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling fear in her eyes. We're not just hiding anymore. We're not running. Zane, you have a choice. Zane scoffed, the sound bitter. A choice? I don't have a choice. I'm a weapon. I'll always be a weapon. His words hung in the air as a warning. The moment his control slipped, he could become the very thing he feared, the monster unleashed. He didn't want to be that. He didn't want to be the tool of a ruthless regime. But he was terrified that, without the General's leash around him, he'd lose control altogether. Before Evelyn could speak again, the doors to the Resistance chamber slammed open, and a group of ragged fighters poured in, faces grim and worn. Among them was Lieutenant Tessa Marks, a sharp-eyed leader of the Resistance who regarded Zane with equal parts suspicion and awe. We've got a problem, Tessa said curtly, glancing at Zane. Her gaze flicked to Evelyn, and then back to him. The General's forces are closing in on us. We've got a matter of hours, maybe less, before they breach our defenses. Zane's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He didn't want to lead anyone into this fight, Not when he wasn't sure if he could control the beast within. But he couldn't just sit here and wait for the inevitable. "We don't have hours," Zane muttered, the darkness of his inner thoughts creeping into his voice. "They'll come for me. But if we fight back, if we stand a chance of winning this," he exhaled slowly, his fists unclenching. Tessa eyed him closely, the corners of her mouth tightening. She could see it, the struggle in his eyes, the war within him. But she knew what she needed. What they all needed. "We need your strength, Morrison. No one else here can match your firepower." "I'm not a weapon," Zane said through gritted teeth, his hands shaking with barely restrained rage. "I'm not your tool." "Then prove it," Tessa snapped back. "Help us stop Kael's forces. If you want redemption, if you want a way out, then fight for something greater than yourself." The words hit Zane harder than he expected. Something about the way Tessa had said it, fight for something greater, resonated deep inside him. Was this what he'd been looking for? A way to redeem himself? To stop being the monster that lurked beneath his skin? Dr. Drake's voice broke through his thoughts. "Zane, please. We can do this together. The resistance can be more than just a rebellion, we can be a movement. We can defeat them." Zane stared at the woman he had once trusted, the woman who had created him. A moment passed in heavy silence. Finally, Zane took a deep breath, shaking his head as if ridding himself of the last remnants of his doubt. "I'll fight," he said, his voice low but resolute. "But not for you. Not for the General. I'm doing this for me." As the others assembled around him, Zane finally felt something stir within him that hadn't been there in years. It wasn't the cold, calculated instinct of a soldier. It wasn't the beast, raging inside him. This was something else. Something that, for the first time in his life, made him feel human. The countdown had begun. The ground rumbled beneath Zane's boots, the sound of the approaching enemy forces growing louder with each passing second. He stood at the front lines of the resistance base, a jagged cliffside that overlooked the valley below. A cold wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of metal and smoke. It wasn't just the storm on the horizon that worried him, it was the storm within. He gripped the edge of his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. The roar of the General's army could be heard in the distance, their boots marching in unison like a wave of inevitability. Zane knew the time was near. He had always known it would come to this, an all-out assault on the last stronghold of humanity. But even as the air thickened with tension, there was something else gnawing at him, a pit in his stomach that hadn't been there before. "Zane." Dr. Evelyn Drake's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts, and for a moment, the chaos around him melted away. She stood behind him, looking both resolute and fragile. Her eyes were filled with the same fear he saw in the others, but there was something more, something she hadn't said yet. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her voice a mixture of plea and command. "We can still find another way. You can stay with us. You don't have to fight." Zane turned slowly, his gaze piercing through her. She was wrong. She had to be. "You don't understand, Evelyn. This is who I am. I was made for this. I can't stop now." Her expression softened, but there was a trace of guilt in her eyes. Zane knew that she blamed herself. And maybe, in a way, he blamed her too. But he couldn't afford to dwell on that now. The General and his forces were getting closer. His heart raced, and his body tensed, urging him to fight, to act before it was too late. "Zane, you're not just a weapon," she insisted. "You have a choice." Her hand trembled as it reached for his arm, but he pulled away before she could touch him. "I've made my choice," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "This is who I am. But I'll be damned if I let them take over again. If I'm going to fight, I'll do it my way." Evelyn's mouth tightened, her brow furrowed as if she were trying to process his words. She wanted to save him. She always had. But Zane knew something she didn't. There was no saving him, not from what he had become. Not from the beast that lurked inside him, waiting for a reason to break free. Just then, The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, followed by a low, mechanical hum. The general's army was close now, too close. "We have to move," Zane said, turning back toward the horizon. His voice was no longer laced with doubt or hesitation. The storm was here, and he was ready. He could feel the power surging through his body, the rage, the energy, the need to destroy. Evelyn opened her mouth to protest, but the sound of footsteps interrupted her. Lieutenant Tessa Marks appeared, her face grim, eyes steely. She didn't speak right away, she didn't need to. Her presence alone told Zane everything he needed to know. "They've breached the outer defenses," Tessa said bluntly. "We need to push them back, or we won't survive the night." Zane nodded, his gaze focused. The others were already assembling, preparing for the inevitable assault. Resistance fighters, some hardened veterans, others barely out of training, all standing together for the first time in their lives with one unified purpose. And then there was Zane. He was no longer a part of their group, not in the way they needed him to be. He was the hammer. The one who would strike down their enemies and, if things went wrong, the one who would bring the storm. "Zane, Evelyn's voice faltered again, her words hanging in the air. But he didn't have time for her doubts, her wishes, or his own. There was only one thing left to do. "Stay safe," he said, his tone softer than he intended. "Keep the others safe." He turned to face Tessa, who stood at the ready with her squad. "You have your orders, Lieutenant." "Led them?" Tessa nodded without hesitation, leading her team toward the fortified trenches that ran along the cliffside. Zane lingered for only a moment before following her, his instincts pulling him forward. He could already feel the anticipation building, the blood in his veins growing hotter. As they neared the front lines, Zane's transformation began. The energy pulsed within him, a surge of strength that made his body tremble. He knew what was coming, he had no control over it anymore. The monster inside him was waking, and once it broke free, there would be no stopping it. "Zane," Evelyn called out one last time, but he didn't turn back. He couldn't. The first wave of the general's forces stormed toward them, armored soldiers with weapons raised, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Zane's breath quickened, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails cut into his skin. His vision blurred as the beast inside him surged forward, demanding release. Without thinking, Zane lunged into the fray, his speed and strength overwhelming the first wave of attackers. The resistance fighters followed, emboldened by his sheer force, but it was Zane who led the charge, his body moving like a blur of destruction. The battle had begun. And Zane had finally embraced the beast within him. The battle raged with an intensity that seemed to twist the very air around them. The sound of gunfire and explosions rattled the ground, while the acrid scent of burning fuel mingled with the earthy odor of sweat and fear. Zane's body moved on instinct, his every action a blur of calculated violence. The resistance fighters followed in his wake, but it was clear that he was no longer just one of them. He was something else now, something more dangerous, more primal. His enhanced senses took in every detail, the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, the sudden, panicked cries of enemies caught in the chaos, the quickening heartbeat of the men and women he fought alongside. Zane could feel their fear, their anxiety. He could smell it on the air, thick and sour. But in him, there was no fear. There was only the surge of power, the need to destroy. Zane's vision sharpened, the blur of his surroundings transforming into focused clarity. He saw the general's forces advancing from the east, a wave of armored soldiers storming their way. The sound of their footsteps was thunderous, a rhythm that matched the pounding of his own heart. Each soldier in the line wore a look of unshakable confidence, their faces hidden behind helmets, but Zane could sense their anticipation. The resistance fighters were holding their ground, but it wouldn't be enough. Not without Zane. "Hold the line." Tessa's voice rang out above the chaos. She stood at the front, her rifle steady, directing the others with military precision. She was a leader, and Zane had to admit that her resolve impressed him. But she was only human. She couldn't understand the storm brewing inside him. The first wave of soldiers collided with the front lines, and Zane felt the air thrum with the violence of the collision. He wasn't sure how it happened, but suddenly, his feet were moving faster than he'd ever anticipated. He was charging into the fray, his body cutting through the smoke-filled air as though he was weightless. A soldier lunged at him with a plasma sword, but Zane was already there, his fist driving into the man's chest with a force that sent him sprawling to the ground. Before the soldier's body even hit the dirt, Zane was moving again, his arms a blur of motion, crushing enemies with brutal efficiency. But there was no satisfaction in the violence. It wasn't enough to silence the gnawing hunger inside him. Each enemy he took down only fed the rage, the hunger for more destruction. He could feel the monster inside him, clawing at the surface, demanding to be set free. And he didn't know how much longer he could hold it back. "Zane!" Evelyn's voice cut through the madness, but he didn't look up. He couldn't. He was too far gone now. The beast had been unleashed, and nothing was going to stop it. The ground shook as another explosion ripped through the front line, sending a shockwave of dust and debris flying in all directions. Zane barely flinched. His body moved like a machine, his thoughts consumed by the instinct to survive and destroy. But then, through the smoke, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The General Kael stood at the center of the battlefield, surrounded by his elite guard. His tall, imposing figure seemed to radiate an unnatural calm, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. Kael's eyes locked onto Zane, his gaze piercing, almost predatory. The General had always known how to control him. And now, Zane realized, Kael was playing a different game. "You've come a long way, weapon," Kael's voice carried over the battlefield, sharp and mocking. "But you're still mine. You always have been." Zane's pulse quickened. He could hear the General's words, could feel the weight of them pressing on his chest. He had been created for this. A tool of war, a weapon forged in fire. But hearing Kael's voice, hearing that smug tone, made something inside him snap. "No," Zane growled, his voice barely a whisper, but it was enough. The world seemed to slow around him, the noise of the battle fading into the background as his eyes locked onto Kael. For a brief moment, he was no longer the weapon. He was Zane, the man who had tried to outrun his past. But Kael wasn't finished. "You are nothing more than a tool, Zane. And tools are meant to be used." A burst of pure rage exploded from Zane's chest. The beast inside him roared to life, tearing through the remnants of his humanity. His body surged forward, the power of his enhanced limbs propelling him through the air as though gravity had no hold on him. He barely felt the gunfire that rang out from every direction as he tore through the General's guards, his fists and feet moving with a ferocity that left no room for hesitation. Zane's eyes narrowed as he closed the distance between himself and Kael. The General was still standing, unmoving, waiting. Kael's confidence was his downfall. Zane reached him in seconds, his fist slamming into Kael's chest with enough force to crack the plating of the man's armor. Kael staggered back, his expression shifting from cold confidence to something closer to surprise. But the General wasn't finished yet. He reached out, drawing a weapon from his side, a blade of gleaming red plasma. "You think you can stop me?" Kael hissed, his voice laced with fury. But Zane was done. He wasn't the tool anymore. He wasn't Kael's puppet. The beast inside him roared louder than ever, and with a final, primal scream, Zane launched himself at Kael, his body a blur of violence, intent on ending this once and for all. This was his battle now. And this time, he was the one in control. The battlefield had fallen eerily silent for a moment, save for the distant crackling of flames and the soft whine of damaged tech. Zane stood before the General, his chest heaving as his blood pulsed with the aftermath of his rage. Kael's body was sprawled on the ground, his plasma blade discarded at his side, the edge dull from impact. Zane's fists were still clenched, trembling with the energy of the battle. His breathing slowed as the beast inside him began to quiet, retreating to the depths of his consciousness. But the echo of his transformation, the power of the rage he had unleashed, still rang in his ears. He could feel it, deep inside, a hunger that would never fully go away. Kael groaned, lifting his head slightly, his eyes glaring at Zane with a mixture of disbelief and hatred. You think you've won? The general's voice was strained, weak, but still laced with venom. You're nothing but a weapon. A tool for destruction. You can never escape that. Zane looked down at Kael, his expression cold. There was no joy in his victory. No sense of triumph. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was fighting for something deeper. Something that had been buried inside him for far too long. The power to choose who he wanted to be. I'm not your weapon, Zane said quietly. His voice was steady, calm, but there was an undeniable strength in it. And I'm not your tool. He stepped forward, placing a boot on Kael's chest, the weight of it final. I'm human. For a moment, there was only silence. The winds picked up, stirring the dust around them, as the remnants of the general's forces began to retreat. Zane's eyes scanned the battlefield, his heart heavy. The war was far from over, but this battle, this one had been decided. From the distance, he saw Evelyn and Tessa approaching, their faces drawn with exhaustion but filled with relief. The rest of the resistance followed, their steps hesitant but purposeful. They had fought alongside Zane, and now they would see the outcome of his choice. Evelyn was the first to reach him, her eyes searching his face for something, answers, perhaps. Zane, she began, but the words caught in her throat. Zane met her gaze, his eyes no longer cold and distant, but filled with something else, a flicker of humanity that had been lost. I'm still here, Evelyn, he said softly, still the same person. I've learned to control the beast. It doesn't define me anymore. Tessa stepped up next, her expression hard but not unkind. You saved us, Zane. You stopped him. She paused, looking down at Kael's fallen form. But we still have to rebuild. The war isn't over yet. Zane nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was still so much to do. So much to fight for. But now, there was a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting just to survive. He was fighting for something greater than himself. For the future. We fight for our future, Zane said, his voice firm. For humanity. For what we can become. Evelyn stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. And we'll fight alongside you. Together. Zane didn't say anything in response. He didn't need to. The weight of the words was enough. He had faced his demons, had embraced the beast within him, and now he was ready for whatever came next. The war was far from over, but he knew one thing for sure, the fight for humanity would be theirs to win. With the sun setting behind them, Zane stood tall, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His heart, once torn between two sides of himself, was now whole. And as the last of the general's forces retreated into the distance, Zane knew that his true journey was only just beginning. And this time, it would be on his terms.